Talking about
penis
sex.
goes in there.
Subversive idea.
And it warms up.
Talking about sex on Hack.
How many people have you slept with? Hello, Tom Tilley with you for day 2 of a special look at sex on Hack. I mean, how do you really answer that question? Do you answer it truthfully? I spoke to a lot of you at a recent Laneway festival, and I was actually pretty surprised how many women admitted to lying to their boyfriends about their sex count. Listen to this. When you're in a relationship, do you ever bring up the question of how many sexual partners you've had?
No.
Yes.
Yeah, it came up. I asked him.
Why did you ask?
Curiosity.
That's a magic number.
What would your friends consider slutty?
They'd probably say over 5.
So what do you say?
I would say 3.
But how many people have you slept with?
I'd rather not say.
I think I probably left a few out.
So you lied?
Yes.
Why?
A guy that I know said that it's bad for women to have more than 3 sexual partners. And I was horrified. Do whatever you want, but I think people do judge you for it.
Hack. Text 0439 75 7555.
Oh, liars, liars, liars. And you can see video footage from those interviews on the Hack website. That's triplej.net.au/hack. Yes, I was out there doing a bit of a sex survey. And when you're talking about the count, the most recent research we found was from 2007. Durex Condoms did a study that says on average Australians have about 13.3 lovers in their sexual lifetime. So a lot higher than some of the people in that interview. I'm not sure how truthful they were being, even with me. With me, can you believe it? I'd love to know if you've ever lied about your sex count. Girls, if you have lied, why? And if you're a guy, maybe girls have good reasons to lie. I mean, how well as a guy would you handle it if you found out your partner had slept with more people than you? And if you're in a same-sex relationship, I'd love to know, do you think there's the same mistrust and stereotyping that goes on in hetero relationships? Give me a call.
Hack 1300 0555 36. Text 0439 75 7555. Triple J.
One person has texted in saying, what about having no count at all? For some women in their early 20s, I'm 24, their virginity is potentially just as awkward to talk about or not talk about. Instead of being seen as slutty, they could be seen as being frigid. Yeah, I'd love to know your thoughts. Keep texting in 0439 75 7555. One person says, I lost count years ago. It's probably in the hundreds by now. But if a girl I'm dating has a problem, then that's their problem, not mine. I think, hey, it just means I'm a better lay. That's Ella in Canberra. Well, I wanted to find out more about this, so I Skyped US sex researcher Debbie Herbenick to find out why people lie about their sex count, and she reckons you shouldn't even have to talk about it.
I know it's surprising to a lot of people, but I think that we still have a sexual double standard that's at play.
I guess a lot of people might think that would have changed by now, that there would be more equality on these social dynamics.
You would think that, and you would hope that, but at the same time, many women still worry about being perceived as sort of like slutty, and sometimes men will actually exaggerate the number of partners that they have.
Is there an element where women enforce this old-fashioned value on each other?
There is. It's definitely both. Women have been known to do what we call slut shaming, and so making women feel bad because of their sexuality. But there's definitely concerns about men too. And, I'm not only a sex research scientist, but also I work as a sex columnist, and I get so many questions from men who will say things to me along the lines of, they have a new girlfriend. She's had, X number of partners, whether it's 5 or 7 or 11 or whatever it is. And they know that they should feel okay about that. They know that it shouldn't matter, but they can't escape the feeling that it does matter if her number is bigger than his. What? And it eats away at some men.
Why is that?
Oh gosh, I wish I knew. I think for some of it, it's really just, it's stuff where it's really just kind of embedded in ideas about, what a good girlfriend or a good potential wife is supposed to be like. And if you're a good girl, there are sex myths about, you shouldn't initiate too much, or you shouldn't masturbate, or you shouldn't, have more experience than your partner. And unfortunately, those things can really get in the way of people just having, fun with their sexuality and loosening up and being uninhibited and having a good time.
When do you think this kind of stuff is going to change significantly, or will it ever?
Hopefully it will one day. I don't see it changing anytime in the next 10 or so years. I think we've been, chipping away at it for decades, and it'll improve. But I think for the time being, this is kind of what we're still struggling with as a society.
How much damage do you think this double standard does to people's relationships?
Oh, gosh, it does a lot, because you have people hiding from each other, and that's the worst thing to do for intimacy. You want to connect and you want to feel like you can tell your partner anything, but when you're always hiding, it's tough. At the same time, I don't feel like anyone should be compelled to tell their number if they don't want to.
Yeah, do you think people should necessarily have that conversation?
No, I really don't. I think, if it's something you two really want to share, great. But all too often, I think that somebody's number is used to judge them. And when I ask people why they really want to know their partner's number, sometimes they'll say, well, because I'm worried about STIs. Well, if you're worried about infection, go get tested and get your partner tested. But, their number doesn't really tell you much about that person.
I want to see numbers in action. 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 I want to see
Hack. Oh, numbers in action on Hack today. Someone has texted in saying, I have proudly never lied about my number. If you don't want to be with me for that reason, then too bad. Being an out and proud slut is different to being a closet slut who denies it. Love our work, Amy. Well, Kate, what's your story? Have you ever lied about your sex count?
Yeah, I have. Depending on who I was seeing at the time, I will only tell what I have to. So former boyfriends, or people that I might bump into, and the story might come up and it might come out that, yeah, we did have a sexual relationship.
So a very practical approach. Why do you feel like you don't have to tell them the true number of people you've slept with?
Well, I would prefer not to have the conversation at all, but it tends to come up. I just think it's my own business, but you can't deny that you had sex with your ex-boyfriend. Like, it's obviously, if the conversation comes up, you've got to say something. But it just causes massive jealousy problems, and I don't know, I can understand why girls lie about it because it just avoids an argument.
Have you had guys that have had less sexual partners than you getting really upset about your sex count?
I've had guys tell me their number, and I've told them my version of my number, and I've laughed to myself because they've said to me, oh, it's okay that I've had more partners than you, but when I think about my actual number, it might be that I'm revealing, say, 5 and they're revealing 6, and I'm thinking, well, if you knew my real number, you wouldn't say that to me, and that's what it comes down to, is if I told them the truth, I'd have a completely different reaction.
Kate, thanks so much for the call. One person has texted in saying, my girlfriend has slept with 5 times more people than me. I don't mind, and you can tell where it counts. I guess that's in the bedroom is what you're referring to there, Chris. Thanks so much for the call. Another person's texted in saying, I'm in a same-sex relationship, and I think there still are the same types of things. It depends on the person. I've lied about it, upping my number because I felt it would make me more attractive. That's Sarah in Sydney. Jenny, you told your partner about your sexual history, and it's become a massive problem.
This was nearly a year ago, and we stayed together, and things did get better. But for the first few months, it was really hard.
Was your count higher than his?
Yes, probably 3 times higher. And I think we didn't even need to have the conversation probably, so I would either lie or not have the conversation in the future.
Wow, okay, it's just not worth it in your experience?
I don't think so, because when it comes down to it, and we tried really hard to talk about why it was even an issue, I think what it comes down to is it doesn't matter if you're healthy and if you're in love with each other, your previous sexual history probably doesn't matter as long as you're safe.
It's funny you mention healthy because that's what we're going to talk about next on the show, because that's probably a more important conversation, right? Yeah. About have you practiced safe sex or have you been tested?
Yeah, exactly. I'd rather know if someone's had tests done rather than, how many they've slept with.
Yeah, very interesting. Yeah. Thanks so much for the call, Jenny.
That's all right. Okay.
Talking about sex on Hack.
on hack. Yeah, it's pretty obvious that's what we're doing the whole half hour on the show today and for the rest of the week. And if you heard yesterday's show, you probably still haven't forgotten one of our callers, a caller called Sarah. She rang in to tell us she'd had bad sexual chemistry with her husband for 4 years and she was going to have to break up with him today on Valentine's Day of all days. It was such an intense story, and I did try and call her today to find out how things had gone down, and she didn't pick up the phone. No surprises why. Anyway, hope they're both okay. Just wanted to bring you up to speed on that one. A lot of people have been wondering what happened. We have been talking about the sex count question, and often that conversation comes up in a bigger conversation about safe sex. And obviously the amount of people you've slept with can affect your chance of having a sexually transmitted infection. But maybe a more important question, or a more useful question, is have you been practicing safe sex, and have you ever been tested, or have you been tested very recently since your last sexual partner? And it is important to ask those questions because the number of people still contracting chlamydia is pretty frightening.
20 young people of the ages 16 to 29 years of age have chlamydia. And unfortunately, the majority of them are asymptomatic. They're not aware that they have the infection.
That's Associate Professor David Wilson from the Uni of New South Wales. He's Head of Surveillance and Evaluation at the Kirby Institute.
There is good news that people are getting tested more. But unfortunately, we are seeing a large resurgence of chlamydia, and it's sexually transmitted. That clearly points to the fact that condoms are not being used routinely. And we're seeing that in some of the statistics as well. We don't have good data on the levels of condom use across the country, but we do know that levels are clearly not sufficient enough to control these infections being spread.
In a 2009 study by the Federal Health Department, only 52% of the 15 to 29-year-olds surveyed said they'd used a condom the last time they had sex. And in the same age group, almost 60,000 cases of chlamydia were reported in 2010. Among Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, the rates of chlamydia infection are 3 times higher than in the rest of the population. And 36% of all cases of gonorrhea are found in Indigenous people.
We saw a large increase, 25% increase in gonorrhea in the last year. That's about 10,000 Australians were diagnosed with gonorrhea last year. About 10% of all gay men are infected with HIV, but fortunately we're seeing levels fairly stable at the moment.
Between the year 2000 and 2010, the number of Aussies living with HIV rose to 21,000. That's a 72% increase. And of all the cases diagnosed in 2010 alone, 27% were among young people. Over the last 5 years, about 1,000 people have been diagnosed with HIV.
Although it's predominantly among gay men, we are seeing slight emergences more towards some heterosexual populations. So we're seeing people particularly who come from high prevalence countries, so places in Africa or in Asia, and also people who travel to those countries and have sex while they're overseas. They're particularly at risk.
David says the good news is that some STDs are on the decline in Australia.
There's a large number of people living with hepatitis C, and unfortunately that leads to long-term complications for the liver, but we are seeing declines in that disease. But probably the best success story is genital warts, and that's associated with the cervical cancer vaccine that was introduced a few years ago.
Thanks to that vaccine, the rates of young women diagnosed with genital warts, which lead to cervical cancer, has dropped from 11% to 3% in just 5 years.
Hello, John. Welcome. Come on down with me.
To see how these stats translate to the real world, I checked in with Dr. Sarah Martin. She's the acting director of the Canberra Sexual Health Centre. Sarah says more and more young people are getting tested for STDs, and they're getting more comfortable talking to their partners about it.
The pattern that we're seeing is very similar to the national pattern. Chlamydia, we're particularly seeing an increase in very young people, so 15 to 19-year-old young girls, and generally an increase in the 16 to 30-year-old age group, both men and women. We've certainly seen more cases of gonorrhea than usual in the last year, although to a degree that catches us up with the pattern that we're seeing in the eastern states anyway. Those are largely amongst men who have sex with men.
David Wilson, who you heard from earlier, says he's seeing more and more cases of women with sexually transmitted gonorrhea. Sarah says she occasionally sees people in hetero relationships with it, and it's usually because they've hooked up with someone overseas. When it comes to HIV/AIDS, Sarah says it's much more treatable these days.
We really don't talk about AIDS anymore. We just talk about HIV and living with HIV. HIV with good treatment and the ability to keep taking the treatment becomes a long-term illness, not unlike diabetes, for example. But that's not to say that the emotional component of being diagnosed with HIV isn't enormous.
That's Dr. Sarah Martin from Canberra Sexual Health Centre, ending that report from John Barrington. Lyle, you're a bit freaked out by the number of women who don't want to use condoms.
Yeah, it really concerns me. But what really freaked me out is because I've had a number of unwanted pregnancies, and now you bring up this case about gonorrhea, it's really even more scarier.
How common is it that the women you meet don't want to use condoms?
Or I've only had one in the past 10, probably sexual encounters that insisted on condoms.
Right, okay. Do you think that's changed compared to maybe the culture around condom use 5 or 10 years ago?
I know I was pretty much in a solid relationship 10 years ago, so now...
All right, well, we won't delve too far back into your count, Lyle, but thanks so much for the call. In the studio, I have Alicia Ross, who's the CEO of the Youth Empowerment Against HIV/AIDS organisation. Alicia, welcome to the show, and it's not Happy Valentine's Day for you, it's Happy National Condom Day, and you've brought me in a packet of safe sex information and condoms and a little steel case here that I actually can't open, which would be pretty awkward in the heat of the moment, but thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks for having me.
Now, is the safe sex message a bit of a harder sell these days when you don't have the Grim Reaper who was around in the ads in the early days after the HIV/AIDS epidemic of the 80s and 90s?
Well, clearly fear did do a lot to motivate people, going back sort of 30 years ago, when we had the Grim Reaper and when HIV was new. But I think, when anything's new, whether it's a new outbreak, whether there's, escalating, statistics, then it's easy to be really reactionary. But actually what we're talking about here is sex. And the thing that I think is quite incredible is, why are we having such a hard time selling something that we all love to talk about? We all love to do it. It's a natural and normal thing. But I think maybe the catch really there is, do we feel safe to talk about it? I've been listening to the program, and incredible to hear the amount of people that when they're asked to talk about their sexual experiences, they're talking about lying or feeling ashamed or embarrassed. They should be talking about how fun and awesome and great it is.
Well, speaking of fun, a lot of the argument people put forward about condoms is that having sex with a condom is not as good as having sex without a condom.
Well, I think actually what we try to do is sort of remind people of the fact that safe sex is more than just disease-safe sex. Safe sex is actually about feeling comfortable to talk to your partner, negotiate condom use. There are lots of fun ways that condoms can be used in the bedroom. But, I think it's about people, feeling comfortable in having great, fantastic sex. And safe sex isn't just the boring sort of health part of this, but actually healthy relationships, making choices that you don't regret the next day, the next week, or maybe for the rest of your life.
But the pleasure question is a hard one. How do you answer that?
Well, I think pleasure sort of links back to what I was saying before. We are a bit stifled as a community still to talk about sex in a sort of a science health sort of way, and actually what we should be doing a lot more of is talking about pleasure. And our team, our guys get out there, on the ground in spaces where young people like to hang out and talk about these very topics.
But what do you say directly to somebody that says, yeah, that's all good, but it's not as fun having sex with a condom as it is without it? How do you address that directly?
Well, you've got to be honest and say, if your choice is you don't want to use a condom, then you've got to think about some other choices you can make, like going along and getting an STI test and knowing that you and the person you're going to have sex with aren't going to go home the next day going, gee, that was more fun than having to use a condom, but actually now I've got, a health problem or an unwanted pregnancy as a result.
Yeah, since we've moved on from the days immediately during and post the HIV/AIDS epidemic, people are looking at the risks in a different way. And some people I've heard say, well, if only 4 or 5% of the population have an STI and, the people I'm sleeping with are probably below average, and if I do get chlamydia, it can be cured by medicine. What do you say to somebody who comes at you with that argument?
Well, actually, 4 to 5% in an age group is a reasonable amount. And
it's 1 in 20.
It is 1 in 20, and, you know, I guess a big part of this is, I think people have this sort of misconception that it's about counting numbers. I know you've been talking about counting numbers today.
Yeah.
And actually, unsafe sex is unsafe sex. You know, it doesn't take 100 times, it doesn't take 200 times, it can take one time. So, you know, what really matters is, you know, how much do you care about yourself and the person that you're sleeping with? Doesn't have to be a long-term partner, could be a casual partner, could be a one-night stand, but your choice is your choice. But do you really want to have to keep living that choice the next day, the next week, and you know, for time going onwards?
Yeah, with some diseases, the ramifications are absolutely horrendous. And one person has texted in saying, as a lesbian, I still use condoms on my sex toys. I think it's important, but it's not talked about as much as it should be. Another person says, my partner has genital warts. We talked about it at the start of the relationship, weighed up our options, went to the doctors, and are now engaged, and I get tested all the time. I'd love to know what you think. We are talking about STIs and safe sex on Hack today. Do you think we've become blasé about safe sex? And if so, why? Give me a call.
Hack 1300 0555 36. Text 0439 75 7555. Triple J.
Very interesting that we just got that text about genital warts and making that work in a relationship and keeping yourself disease-free, because if you do live with an STI, having safe sex and that conversation around it is unavoidable. You're about to meet Steph. She's 20. And she was born HIV positive. Now, that actually doesn't mean she struggles to get a date. But when she dates guys that don't have HIV, convincing them to stick around long enough to hear how low the risk of infection isn't that easy. Irene Scott has Steph's story.
You just have to put a condom on and we're fine. The whole thing of it being connected to drugs and sex and homosexuality means that people are very, very afraid. And there's no reason they should be.
Hi, my name's Stephanie. I'm 20 years old and I'm HIV positive. My mother, yes, she had HIV, but she didn't realise it until I was 2 years old. So her partner, before my dad died, and there was a notice in the newspaper saying what he had died of, and she decided to get tested, and it turned out that her and I were both positive. She was in love with my dad and had babies, and I mean, my mother, you can see it in her eyes, she didn't want to pass on her previous sexual history to her children. I know nothing different. Everything that goes along with HIV is just my life. Your body is so tired from fighting all the time that some days you just want to crawl back into bed and not deal with it. And that's just the fact of having an illness. I met my boyfriend at a HIV positive camp for high school students when I was 13, and I fell madly in love with this 16-year-old confident guy. Our relationship is very open and there's no secrets. My partner and I decided that we would have an open relationship so we could explore everything that life has to offer. So when we're out together, we're together. When we're out alone and separate, it's free for all. I look like a normal 20-year-old girl in a miniskirt heading out to a club. I mean, there's no tattoo on my face saying HIV positive girl. If I'm in a relationship with you and I want to have sex with you, then you should know. But otherwise, if I'm in a club and we're sharing a drink, there's no reason that they should know. The myths are that, foreplay will mean that you'll get infected, which is completely not true. The only way you could infect someone is if it's unprotected without a condom. I mean, you'd have to swallow massive amounts of saliva to even think about it being a possibility, and it's very, very frustrating. You don't just ask someone point blank, are you HIV positive? I have a rule to let them get to know me as a person before I spring that on. Just sitting down and saying, look, this is what I have. Here is the information. If you have any questions, call me. And then leaving them, because the first reaction is not always the definite reaction. First reaction is always going to be shock or horror. Let them come to you after that, and then see where it goes. A lot of people are scared away. A lot of my positive girlfriends will finally get up to that point and be sure and be waiting at the phone and then never hear back. And I mean, that's when we use the phrase, those that matter do not mind, those that mind do not matter. And you just got to hold your head high and say, well, that's not really worth my time. And it's not attractive quality, someone who doesn't like
people because they have a certain illness. I mean, HIV these days is not a death sentence. There are a lot more diseases that you should be scared of. When they call back and decide that they want to continue the relationship, it's extremely exciting in the fact that it doesn't matter to them as you would think it would. When you start a relationship upfront and honest with no barriers, then that's a much better way to start it. I can guarantee you this is not the first time that you've come in contact with it. It's just this person choosing to be honest with you because they actually care about you. I think everyone just needs to take a big freaking chill pill and get over the fact that some people have illnesses and other people do not. And as long as you carry around this wonderful invention called a condom, nothing is going to happen to you except maybe a really, really good experience. You just have to take the plunge.
Steph, a 20-year-old girl who's HIV positive, speaking to Irene Scott. And Jess, you had to have that conversation with your partner because you had herpes. How was it?
It was pretty awkward, actually.
How early on in the relationship did you bring it up?
From the word go, I had to. I don't believe that was something, because it's such a contagious STI, I didn't think that it was something we could not talk about.
When you say from the word go, do you mean the first time you went on a date or the first time you got physical?
First time we went on a date, it had to be done.
How did he react?
He was shocked, but he also respected my honesty, and I think because we'd been friends for quite a long time before then, I think the relationship was already there anyway. It was just a matter of taking the next step, but he needed to know what he was in for.
Yeah, thanks so much for the call, Jess.
No worries.
I've got Alicia Ross in the studio, who's the CEO of the Youth Empowerment Against HIV/AIDS. Now, Alicia, we've heard a few people who have been able to broach that conversation quite early on. Do you have to tell people straight away?
Well, actually, when we think about do you have to tell, you can't tell anybody anything if you don't know. And I think that's a really important message for people to think about, which is, it is a person's right to decide when is the right time for them to disclose information. You know, you've been talking about information disclosure, during this whole show, whether it's about the number of people you've slept with, whether it's about whether you've got an STI.
It's all about the conversation.
It is all about the conversation. But actually, I think you've got to think about whether or not a person might not know. You might not know that you actually have an STI. So, err on the side of caution. It's the best way to go.
How often do you think people should be getting tested if they are having regular sex with different people?
Well, it comes down to how often are they having unsafe sex. It really is a case of it can only take, one unsafe experience. So people hopefully aren't engaging in regular unsafe sex. It tends to be that the condom broke or it was the heat of the moment, and it's more the rarity rather than the regular sort of
What
way.
if people are practicing safe sex all the time? How often should they get tested?
If they're practicing safe sex all the time, then, there shouldn't be an issue. However, relationships always have an element of trust, and you can never take that out of it. It's never foolproof. So, this whole idea of being able to feel safe to talk to your partner and to share, what your sexual history is a really important part of negotiating, if you're using condoms, not using condoms, and what choices you're making about getting tested.
One person texted in saying, the thing I don't like about getting an STI check is that when the doctor acts sometimes in an aggressive way, saying things like, what were you thinking? You're playing Russian roulette with your dick. They should be more supportive of your initiative. And another person says, where do I get an STI test from? Is it at your GP?
Definitely you can go along to your GP. I think one of the issues a lot of people face is not knowing their rights about confidentiality, particularly I think also in regional towns where communities are smaller, more tight-knit. The local doctor may be your family doctor. You've been seeing since you're a kid. You're now sexually active. You don't really want to go there because you're worried that your parents might find out. So people feeling confident about knowing that actually it's your right to confidentiality with your relationship with your doctor.
Alicia Ross, thanks so much for joining us, and thanks for the safe sex packet there full of condoms, even some of them glowing in the dark.
Thanks, Tom. Well, look, we've actually got a bit of a Valentine's gift for everyone out there. We want to share the love. So if anyone else would like a safe sex kit this Valentine's Day, just check out redaware.org.au safe sex, and we'll be sure to get one out in the mail to you.
Good on you. Catch you later.
Thanks, Tom.
Hack with Tom Tilley on Triple J.
And that is all we have time for on the show today. Tomorrow on the show, we're talking about straight guys getting a bit of gay action. No one seems to blink when girls do it. Why is it taboo for guys? Linda's up next. Catch you later.